Good morning. We begin by thanking the sponsors of today's shir, the Talmud Torah sponsors for the month, Yanky and Aliza Statman and Yitzy and Rebecca Statman in commemoration of the first yarzheit of Menucha Shaindl Yehudis Dovid Yosef. The Shulamit should have an Aliyah, and the family should have an Chama. We thank Shmuel and Robyn Korobkin for their sponsorship as well, in commemoration of the 25th yarzheit of Robyn's mother, Melanie Solomon, Allah Shalom, Pessa Mira Bas Chaim. We also thank the sponsor of the Week of Learning, Jeff and Debbie Schwartz, in commemoration of the 5th yarzheit of Debbie's mother, Shulamit Bas Shmuel. Again, the Neshama should have an Aliyah, and the family should have an Chama. We are going to begin today, Daf Yud Dalet. We're going to review the mission that we started yesterday on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis with the brand new parak. The parak begins, Elu Mutarin. The following are mutter. So we learned this Mishnah yesterday, so we'll go through it again very quickly. Here we are beginning with a bunch of different terminology that a person can use where the neder will not take effect, where it will be mutter. So the Mishnah begins, Chulin sha'ochelecha. The person says, this is chulin that I will eat. In other words, that which I will eat will be chulin. So again, that's not a valid lashon of neder. It's chulin, and everything is fine. Now the Mishnah lists a number of different prohibitions. So we went through these yesterday. All these prohibitions are prohibited because they are naturally, according to the halachas of the Torah, aser. It has nothing to do with the neder. So this is considered a davar ha'aser, not a davar ha'nadar. We're going to spend time today looking into the source of that. But we've learned in the past that when a person uses the methodology of hatfasa, a person tries to accomplish a neder by way of hatfasa, which is association. I associate a davar hamutter, something which is otherwise permissible, with something which is prohibited. That is a valid way of making a neder. I associate a piece of meat which is perfectly kosher and permissible to eat with a piece of meat which is going to be aser. So if that isser, if that prohibition is because of a vow, then that's a valid neder. If that prohibition is because of a natural state of isser, then it's not a valid neder. We're going to list a number of cases of natural isurim which have nothing to do with a neder. And it starts off with kibisar chazir, like the meat of a chazir, pork. He says that this piece of meat should be like basar chazir. So that's aser. It's aser from the time that it was created. From the time that the Torah said that you can't eat chazir, it was always aser, it never will change. Kavodas kechavim, like avodah zara. Ka'oros levuvim, yesterday we described avodah zara is avodah zara. Oros levuvim is takrobis avodah zara, which is taking an animal and the service of avodah zara. It's one of the ways of serving avodah zara is that they would make some type of cut or an incision parallel to the heart, and they'd yank out the heart of the animal while it's still alive. Quite a disgusting and barbaric procedure that they would do for avodah zara. That is something which is a higher level of avodah zara, because not only is it avodah zara, but in such a case it can't even be ultimately removed. It becomes avodah zara permanently. Kinevelos, a trephos. Nevelo is an animal which dies on its own. Trephos is an animal which is attacked or it gets sick and therefore it dies. In those cases, there's some element of tumah there as well. Kishkotsim v'ramasim, again, those are prohibited creepy crawly things, which also have a higher level of tumah or a more stringent level of tumah because they are tamei b'chadasha, the size of a lentil, which is much smaller. Kechalas arnuk truma, so like the chala of Aaron and his truma, those are going to any one of those terminology that a person uses to try to accomplish a neder, mutter. It is permissible for him to eat that piece of meat or anything else that he's associating with any of the above mentioned items, because that is not a valid terminology for a neder, and therefore it doesn't work. Why? We're going to see soon in the Gemara, but the reason is because all those things are naturally aser, and that is a davar ha'aser, not a davar ha'nador. Person says, Omer le'ishto, a person says to his wife, Hare'at alai ki'ima, you should be upon me like my mother. We explained yesterday, just like a person's mother is a prohibited relationship, person says to his wife, you should be to me like my mother. So the person is essentially saying, you should also be a prohibited relationship for me. So he is asering his wife with a neder. In such a case, poskin lo pesach b'makom acher. So again, person's mother is usher to them. There's a prohibition to have any relationships with the person, to have a relation with a person's mother, not because of any neder. It's asr midoraisa. It's a davar ha'asr. So therefore, when a person says that his wife should be like his mother, that too is not a valid neder. That's not a valid terminology that can use for hatfasa, for association of a neder. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says, poskin lo pesach b'makom acher. We make him find the pesach b'makom acher. We explained yesterday as well. When a person comes to nullify a vow, they have to have some type of pesach. Usually the pesach could be that I did not understand the implications, the ramifications of making this neder. So here it has to be something outside. The Ran explains that you can't just say, it wasn't respectful to my mother. It wasn't respectful to my mother, I didn't realize it wouldn't be respectful to my mother. We actually make the person come up with another pesach for their neder, and then he has to nullify the vow. Why? Shlo yakel rosh l'lakach, because we don't want a person to be very, flippant. We don't want people to be flippant with these type of nedarim to say these things. The Gemara is going to explain that this mission is referring to an am aretz. When it comes to a Talmud Chacham, he does not need to have a nullification of this vow. We're worried about people who are amaratzim. We'll describe later in the Gemara what that means. But ultimately, it's not a valid expression of a neder for a person to say to his wife, you should be like my mother, but because we are concerned about what's going to happen as a consequence of people making these types of nedarim, Chazal nevertheless said he has to go ahead and nullify that vow. The Gemara continues. Going back to the first cases of the Mishnah. Taima da'amar chulan she'ochalacha. It seems like the reason why the neder does not work is because the person said that the food that I have is chulin she'ochalacha. Now, which means that which I eat will be chulin. However, what happens? Ha'amar lachulin, it should be lachulin she'ochalacha. Then that's mashma lo lechulin lahave ella carbon. If he would have added in the lamid when he said chulin she'ochalacha, and then it turns into lachulin she'ochalacha, Gemara understands in such a case it would have been a valid neder because his intention would have been lo lechulin lahave. This food that I'm pointing to should not be like any other chulin, which is always permissible. Rather, lahave ella kikarbon. It should be like a carbon which is a sacrifice, which is obviously asur for a person to eat. So again, we're inferring from the words of our Mishnah that if he would have said lachulin, then we would have understood that he meant to say that the food that I have should not be chulin, rather it should be like a carbon, which is a classic example of michlal lav ata shomeahin. So the Gemara says, Mani, who is the one who is of this opinion? Mani masnisin, who's the Tana of our Mishnah? Rabbi Meir, if it's going to be Rabbi Meir, halas the michlal lav ata shomeahin. We already established earlier that Rabbi Meir requires you to verbalize exactly what's on your mind. You can't just say, I won't do this, and we'll infer from your words what you will do. You have to be explicit about what you're going to do. So this Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir does not hold of that concept of Michlal Lav included in saying no, Ata Shomei Ahain, you hear the yes. And this Mishnah, clearly, from the inference we're making in the terminology of the Mishnah, requires you to hold of that concept of Michlal Lav Ata Shomei Ahain. So the Gemara on top of Yitalim and Aleph, Ve'elo Rabbi Yehuda. So it must be that it's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who disagrees with Rabbi Meir on that concept. So then we have a problem. Hainu Reisha. We already have pretty much the exact same Mishnah on Daf Yudam Beis. We saw this. It's interesting that the Gemara calls it Reisha when it's another parak, but it means Reisha at the beginning of the Masechta on Daf Yudam Beis. If you turn back quickly over there, you'll see Ha'omer lachulin she'ochalacha. That's the Mishnah over there, and we have clearly where Rabbi Yehuda says that is a valid neder. So we learned this already. So the Gemara says, "Adi the katani kibsar chazir kavod kachavim lachi katani chulin." So says the Gemara, you know what? The Mishnah does add in the case of chulin, which is not necessary. We don't have to say that case. But since we were listing all these other cases, we started it off with a similar case, which was chulin. In other words, you're right, it is superfluous, it was mentioned earlier, but it's not such a problem because it fits with the flow of the rest of the Mishnah. Ravina disagrees, and he says, Hachi katani. Ve'elu mutarin kachulin. In other words, you have to understand that when the Mishnah says at the beginning, chulin she'ochalacha, it doesn't mean that that was an expression of a neder. Because the expression using the terminology chulin in your neder was already addressed previously in the first parak. So when it says chulin in this parak, at the beginning of this parak, what it means is that all of these cases will result in the person's food remaining like any other chulin, which means it's permissible to be eaten. Now what's the case? The following expressions of a neder will result in the food that you're talking about remaining permissible to be eaten like any other chulin. Kibsar chazir. Person says it should be like kibsar chazir, kavod kachavim, like kavod zara. Now the Gemara says, "V'lo tana chulin havemina b'yisheila." So the Gemara is now analyzing this. Hold on a second. What would I have thought if you wouldn't have said that all these things will remain like chulin? In other words, what's the value you're adding to the Mishnah by saying that's going to be like chulin? Because again, understand the Gemara understands that when the Mishnah gives me an example of something, whenever you give an example of something, it's because the concept's a little difficult to understand. I may have thought A, I may have thought B. So you give an example, so you say, oh good, I have a place where I could compare it to like chulin. So the Gemara is saying, okay, so you must have needed chulin to be there. It's like this, you'll understand, it's mamash like chulin. What's the case of any other chulin? If I go to the store and I want to buy a hamburger, I don't have to do TORAH Nedarim on the hamburger. I just buy it, I make a bracha, and I eat it. So the Mishnah is saying that all these Nedarim result in my food being exactly like that hamburger that I would have bought in the store, like any other chulin. So the Gemara is saying, if you wouldn't have given the example of chulin, I would have thought that something's different and need a Torah. In other words, v'lotana chulin hav'yamina by she'ela. If it wouldn't have said chulin as an example, I would have thought that need she'ela umi ikla sukya datiachi. Would I ever have thought that that's the case? Hamidikatani seifa, since it says at the end of the Mishnah, ha'omer le'ishta Aryeh telai ki'ima. The end of the Mishnah clearly expresses that if a person says to his wife, you should be upon me like my mother, what's the halacha there? In such a case, he does have to have a Torah. So the Mishnah at the end had no problem expressing what the halacha is when you have to have a Torah. So in the fact that the Mishnah did not say that in the beginning, clearly you don't have to have a Torah. So Michlal Doreisha Loiboy She'ela. So therefore, clearly, in the beginning, when it says that it's not a valid neder, it means it's not a valid neder, nothing takes effect, and no she'ela is going to be necessary. No nullification is going to be necessary for this vow. So again, why do you have to add in the word that it's like chulin to tell me that it's perfectly permissible all the way and totally permissible? Of course. Ela machvarta, the Gemara says, white it out. That answer that we get, that Ravina gave, that we are using the word chulin just as an expression of what the halacha is, erase that, chulin memela nas. But we just brought in the word chulin because it flowed well with the rest of the Mishnah. We're talking about other cases which are chulin, and therefore we just carried it along as well. Now the Gemara says, v'no'ani mili. V'no'ani mili, so every time we have a chiddush in the Mishnah, the Gemara is going to always have to ask, v'no'ani mili, where we know it from. In this case, it's a little bit difficult because the Gemara doesn't tell me what we're asking it about. But the V'no'ani mili goes all the way back to the Mishnah on the concept, which is that when you make a neder, and a person takes a vow, that they, through the mechanics of hatfasa, of association, the Gemara is asking, how do I know that I have to compare it to something which is prohibited by way of a neder, and I can't compare it to a case where it's prohibited by way of an issur. So minani mili, that hatfasa, that association only works when I associate it with something which is asur because of a neder. Amar Kra, the Gemara answers, for the pasuk says, Ish ki yidar neder la Hashem. The pasuk says, Ish ki yidar neder, which is a double lashon. It says yidar neder, and it adds lashem. So the Gemara says, ad sheyidar b'davar another, until a person will make a neder with a davar another. It's not clear exactly where this is coming from, and if you look throughout the page, you'll notice there are a few different understandings of what this means. In the Rosh, he's bothered by the fact, it seems like the Gemara, the Rosh's initial understanding of this Gemara is that we're bothered by the fact that it said Yidar Neder, which is a double expression of a Neder. Pasuk could have said Ish ki Yidar Lashem. Why does it have to say Ish ki Yidar Neder? A person will take a vow of a vow. So the double Lashon, the extra word Neder, according to the Rosh, is how we know that when a person makes a neder, they need to express it through the language of a neder and associate it with something which is asur by way of a neder. If you look at the Rosh on the side, he's bothered by the fact that very often we find, it's repeated in this Masechta as well, that when the Torah says something, even if it's not perfectly precise, if it's the Lashon of Bnei Adam, if that's the way that people talk, then you can't really make a drasha from it. So the Rosh says, "Man de islay dibra Torah klashon bnei Adam darashlei mehashem." In other words, if you're going to be bothered by the fact that Yidar Neder seems to be a normal way of talking, and therefore the pasuk also uses that way of talking, because dibra Torah klashon bnei Adam, the Torah sometimes will express something exactly the way that people talk. So then says the Rosh, the drasha will be from the word Lashem. Why do you have to have the word Lashem there? The pasuk could simply have said, Ish ki yidar neder, oy hishava shavua, le'asar Yisrael nashrei. Why Lashem? So the word Lashem tells you, Ad yidar b'davar another, that your neder has to be expressed by comparing it to something which is also by way of a neder. So there's two ways of understanding the Gemara, either from the double Lashon, yidar neder, and if that's not good enough for you, you can learn it from the word Lashem. The Gemara darshans Ad yidar b'davar another, until you can make a neder with a davar hanador. Through associating with something which is also by way of a neder. So Gemara says, hold on a second. Ihachi, if that's the case, you can't stop reading the pasuk right there. Afilu v'davara aser. You should be able to make a neder through atfasa, even by associating with something which is aser, not by a neder, but just naturally aser by way of the Torah. Afilu v'davara aser nami. Why? Because the pasuk continues, the ksiv le'asar isar. The pasuk says Lesser Isar, and that's an Isar. Lesser Israel Nafsho. So the Gemara says Lesser Isar mi boyle lichedetanya. We already need that expression of Lesser Isar for a different drasha, which is Ezo Iso Amar Batorah. This is something that we learned earlier. And Daf Yud Beis and Aleph. The Gemara asks, how do we know that the different expressions of a neder? And if you remember from that Gemara, the point of that Gemara was that a person can make a neder and say something is asr kiyom shemeispo aviv. In other words, he's asking something like the day that his father passed away. Now, what the chiddush over there is that the day that his father passed away is a personal day for him and has no relevance of Isra for anybody else. In other words, it's not like it's Yom Kippur. It's not like it's any other carbon that he turned into an olah and everybody else is forbidden from it. Yom Shemeis Bo Aviv is his personal day on the calendar. So the point of that drasha is that a person can make a neder and ask for something by associating it to Yom Shemeis Bo Aviv, the day that his father died, even though the day that his father died really is only relevant to him. So the Gemara over here is a little shorthand. It doesn't express what that drasha was. But you turn back to Daf Yud Beis, that's what I was talking about. Now it's interesting. The Ran, one of the interesting things about Nedarim is that we have, the Ran is really the primary mefarish on the Masechta, and he throws in a lot of extras over here. So if you look about, I would say 2, 4, 6, about 10 lines up from the bottom, the Ran just summarizes, he writes Hilkach, it should be in bold. Inyan halacha naktina. Halachically, this is how we go. The matfis bedavar ha'asr, lo havi neder, v'lo tzarach she'ela klal. If a person associates a davar ha'mutar with a davar ha'asr, then there's no neder. No neder at all. The whole thing is completely null and void. So if a person says this meat should be like Basar Chazir, there's no neder, it doesn't have to have any hatara. But filu ba'ma'aretz, even if the person's in Amaretz, we're going to explain why that's important, because it's going to come up soon in the Gemara. El b'madr ishtei b'lvat, only when a person makes a neder that his wife, mihaytayim de kasivim masnisan, avol matfis b'davar hanadar. And this is the point, the Gemara that he's adding in. Avol matfis b'davar hanadar. The person does hatfasa through a davar hanadar. Vafilu b'davar she'enoi nadar elo lo bilvad, and he uses something which is only nadar for him, like his father's yarzheit, chayil, it's going to work. So the pasuk teaches us two things. The pasuk teaches us you have to compare the davar hamutar, the permissible item, to something which is asur only because of a neder. However, that neder could be only something which is very personal to you. It doesn't have to be like a communal isser. The Gemara continues. Going back to the Mishnah, Omer Leishto, person says to his wife, Harei ata like ima, you are upon me like my mother. So the Gemara says there's a problem over here. V'raminu, we have a stira. Harei at alai, person says to his wife, Harei at alai should be upon me, kibisar ima, like the flesh of my mother, kibisar achosi, like the flesh of my sister, ke arla, arla is the first 3 years of a tree's life that it gives, that the fruit are going to be asur. So he says that his wife should be like arla, kiklaya karem, like a forbidden mixture in a vineyard. Lo amar klum, it's nothing. The neder doesn't take effect at all. So what's the problem? Our Mishnah agreed in principle that the neder doesn't work, but it's not lo amar klum. The Mishnah still says he has to go to be matra the neder. But that Brisa said that lo amar klum, it's nothing. So Amar Baya, lo amar klum midoraisa. When that Brisa said lo amar klum, that his neder does not take any effect at all, it just meant midoraisa. However, that does not mean that you're done. But tzarich she'ela midrabanan, you still have to go midrabanan and have the vow nullified. Rav Amar, haba tamid chacham, haba amaretz. This is what we were referring to earlier about the difference between a tamid chacham and amaretz. Rav says the case where it's lo amar klum, that if a person says this, then the neder takes zero effect at all. That's talking about a tamid chacham who says this. However, when it comes to an amaretz, that is where a person will have to have the hatara. And the Gemara backs it up by saying, Vatanya, this is not a Vatanya which is a kasha, it's a raya, hanoder ba Torah lo amar klum. We're going to get into this very soon. A person takes neder with the Torah, it's nothing. A person nevertheless has to go ahead and nullify that vow. Does not have to go to a chacham to have that vow nullified. So we see that there's a difference between a Talmud Chacham and Amaretz. Now, in terms of what the difference is, here everyone's turning the page. I just would encourage you to turn back just for 1 second on the Rush. In the Rush, he explains that, I guess the Rush, we have it over here in the Nedarim. It's like a small little sidebar in the margin. He writes, "Amaretz." What's the problem with an Amaretz? She'eno nizhar milidar. The way he's understanding Amaretz over here is he doesn't understand the importance of Nedarim, and therefore he takes Nedarim too often. She'eno nizhar milidar v'chmiru alav kadesh shelo yesar et ishto alav. A person who's constantly, we described yesterday, it was a little bit like in jest, but the point was that a person, an Amaretz, he doesn't understand the weight or the sincerity of making a neder, and therefore, every time he gets upset, he might express a lashon of a neder. Now, it happens to be that today, the lashon that he might use might not be a lashon, might not be a term that will actually make his wife asur. But if he gets upset tomorrow, and he gets into the habit of taking nedarim, and asuring his wife on him every time he gets upset, you know what? Maybe tomorrow he'll actually use a proper terminology, and his wife will be asur on him. So therefore, we just don't want people getting into the habit of doing this at all. Now, what's the difference between, why is it better by a Talmud Chacham? So 2 reasons. Number 1, a Talmud Chacham understands the sincerity of a neder. First of all, hopefully Talmud Chacham is not getting angry at his wife all the time. But even if he is, he understands the sincerity of a neder, and he's not going to be flippant in just saying, you know what? I'm so angry at you. Harei atalai ki'ima. You know what? You're also me like my mother. And then the next day, he uses the valid lashon, which actually might ask for his wife. Talmud Chacham won't do that, so we don't have to worry about it. In other words, two things. First of all, Talmud Chacham is not going to be flippant with Nedarim. Number two, even if he does use a neder, he understands the difference between a neder, which is bedavar hanador, and bedavar asur. So therefore, there's an exclusion made for Talmidei Chachamim. Talmud Chacham finds himself making this neder, you can just ignore the whole thing because it does not take effect. But Namaretz, since he does not understand the difference, and he's also flippant about Nedarim, therefore we make him be mata the neder. The question I saw the poskim deal with who's considered a Talmud Chacham with regard to this. It's an interesting discussion of who's considered a Talmud Chacham in general. And there are a few places where Talmidei Chachamim have a relevance or in halacha where a person needs to be like an approved Talmud Chacham. And one of them is that Talmud Chacham doesn't pay taxes. Now, the Ramah does give a clear description in Yordea about who fits that category. And there are cases where Talmidei Chachamim, where it comes up in Shulchan Aruch, and it's interesting how the description goes. Basically, it has to be someone who can answer questions. In the Sma writes about it. It means the way that the poskim describe an Amaretz is somebody who basically can't learn to save his life. And Talmud Chacham, the opposite, is somebody who could really answer questions all over the place, and even in difficult topics, even if he doesn't know the answer immediately, has the ability within a short amount of time to be able to learn something by himself and come up with the answer. Now, that might be with regard to an exemption of taxes, but it seems the poskim want to say that in this case, it's different. When it comes to taxes, it's for kavod of Talmud Chacham. In other words, the Gemara in Bava Basra talks about certain laws of competition. And the Gemara says that when it comes to certain Talmidei Chachamim, no laws of competition. We want them to be able to get their business done as soon as possible, can make a parnasa, and go home and learn. Why? Because Klal Yisrael recognizes the value that Talmud Chacham's Limud HaTorah has for Klal Yisrael. We don't want Talmidei Chachamim spending their whole day trying to make a sale. We want them to get out there, make their parnasa. The Talmud Chacham says, you know what, I have enough money now to support my family. Now I can go back and learn the rest of my life until I have to go make my next sale. So therefore, out of respect for, number one, the Talmud Chacham, number two, the value that we see in having someone sit and learn and spend his whole day learning, we don't want that person wasting that time. So therefore, we are invested in that person's ability to be able to make a sale. Go make your sale and go back home and learn. Your Talmud Torah is too important to us. That's one concept of a Talmud Chacham. In other words, we value the Torah. In this case, we're a little bit more reluctant to call someone a Talmud Chacham and tell them they don't need to have any Torah, because the whole idea over here is we're concerned about what happens as a result of this neder. Now, whether the person's a bona fide Talmud Chacham, or like in the times of the Sanhedrin, or a person is not, at the end of the day, we don't want to have a situation where these Nedarim are going to be flying around freely. So therefore, the poskim seem to take more of a stringent approach to who's considered Talmud Chacham, and almost nobody nowadays would fit that category with Talmud Chacham. And therefore, if anybody says to their wife, Harei at alai ki'ima, a person should go ahead and be mata that neder. Gemara continues. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Hanodar b'Torah. A person takes at the very top of Yudal Amud Beis. Hanodar b'Torah. So notice there are three different expressions over here. The person takes a neder with the Torah. What's the halacha? Lo amar klum. It's nothing. B'masha kasav ba. Person says he's taking a neder. In other words, b'masha kasav ba, with what is said in the Torah. That's a valid neder. Ba, with the Torah. U'b'masha kasav ba, and with what's written in it. Dvar kayamin. That is a valid neder. So the Gemara says, hold on. Katani b'masha kasav ba. Person takes a neder and he associates it with what is written in the Torah, and then The halach is dvar kayamin. It works. So now why do you have to have the third expression, which is ba ubemashakasaba? So tzarich l'meimar. You have to actually say that case. In other words, the understanding over here is when a person says that he's making a neder like a Sefer Torah. So what does that mean? Does it mean the information in the Torah? Does it mean the Shemos of Hashem in the Sefer Torah? Or does it mean the parchment and the Chaim? What's it referring to? It's referring to the binding. Which part? So the Gemara understands when a person says Bat Torah in the Torah is referring to the physical Torah. The Gvilim, the physical Torah. That's not a valid expression of a neder. But if a person takes a neder b'masha kasav ba with what is written in the Torah, that indeed is quite an intense neder, as a matter of fact. So then why do you have to say that if a person says ba with the actual Torah and what's written in it, that the neder is going to be a good neder? Obviously it's going to be a good neder. Once you know the second line, that once a person associates this neder with b'masha kasav ba, of course the first line, the second one, where it's all inclusive, is going to be a good neder. So Amar of Nachman Lukasha, it's not a question. Ha-demachta oraisa a'ara. That's when the Torah is on the floor. It doesn't mean that it's sitting on the floor, Chalila. The Torah is on the floor. It means it's put down. It's placed down. A'ara in this case means, if it's in the Aron Kodesh, which is on the floor, in other words, it's put down in its place. So in other words, it's put down. Ha-denakit lebiyadeh. The other cases where he's holding it. So just when we're going to say that the Sefer Torah is on the floor, anytime we're going to say that now, we just mean as opposed to him holding it. Holding it is nakit lebiyadeh. The case of putting it on the floor does not mean that the Torah is on the floor, Chalila. It means that he's not holding it. So machta a'ara, if it's placed on the floor, daiti agvili. His mind is on the physical aspect of the Sefer Torah. Nakat labiyadeh, he's holding it in his hand, daiti alaz karasheva. He's actually thinking about the names of Hashem that are in it. Now this is a little bit complicated, because the Gemara didn't really express exactly what it means. Therefore, I would take you to the Ran on the side. Here's where he's holding it. So it's not a very long Ran, but he goes through all the three cases, and it's very important to see this. Sometimes this happens in Masechtas Nedarim, that the Gemara gives an answer, and it's not necessarily as clear. It's a little bit different Masechtas Nedarim than other Masechtas and Shas, but here we have the advantage that you have the Ran. The Ran sometimes is overwhelming because he writes a lot. In this case, it's not such a long Ran and helps us understand the Gemara very much. So look in the Ran. Reisha, the first case, Tehanoder Batorah Lo Amar Klum. The first case when a person was Noder Batorah and it's nothing is the Nakit La Biyade. He's holding it. Vafilu Hachi, nevertheless, Lo Amar Klum. It's nothing. Why? When he said Torah, the expression of Torah always just means the physical Torah. With the parchment. If he actually expresses b'masha kasava, he's holding a Torah, and he says b'masha kasava dvar kayamin. Why did daite ahazkaras shaba? He's actually having in mind the names of Hashem. V'hu nishba b'Hashem. He took a shavua in the name of Hashem. Now, the other side, the flip side, is Aval Seifa, the last two cases, or the last case, B'demachta oraisa a'ara, where the Torah was placed down on the ground. Askinu, we're talking about Lefikach. Ilu Amar b'masha kasav ba bilvad. If he would have simply said b'masha kasav ba lo Amar klum. He's not even holding the Torah. So he says b'masha kasav, but it's nothing. Why? Kivin the machta a'ara, since it's placed down on the floor, Amrina, we assume, daiti agvili, he still is not talking about the content of the Sefer Torah, he's talking about the physical Sefer Torah. That's what he meant when he said b'masha kasav ba, he's referring to the physical Torah, but not the Haskaras, not the names of Hashem. Aval ki amar ba, u'b'masha kasav ba, when he says, in the Torah, and the information that's inside it, and the Haskaras, and the names of Hashem, Mahani, it works, it's a good neder. Why? The Kivin de Amar Ba, Kvar Hizkir Hagvilin. Once he said Ba, he then included the entire physical Torah. Now, the Amar B'masha Kasav Ba, he added in B'masha Kasav Ba. What's the point in that? What value is he adding by saying Masha Kasava? Al Karchach, it must be that his mind is focusing on the names of Hashem. In other words, we have three cases and two scenarios. The Ran takes us through all the combinations of those scenarios, where ultimately we can understand why you'd have to have the middle case of B'masha Kasava and Ba U'B'masha Kasava, and it still makes sense. Because the first time when it said B'masha Kasava, with what's written in it, is talking about where he's holding it. The other case of Ba B'masha Kasava is talking about where it's placed down on the ground, and therefore Ba brings him closer to the Torah. That's he's actually talking about that sefer, the physical sefer, and then B'masha Kasava is the addition. He actually means the Askaros, the names of Hashem which are in it, and that is necessary when it's on the floor. V'iva Yisema. There's another way of answering this. Hold on a second. We have another answer. The whole thing is talking about where it's placed on the floor. The extra case is teaching us the Afrika of the Machta A'ara, even though it's placed on the floor. Kivin to Amr B'masha Kasava Mahani. V'zu vein tzarach l'mer zukatani. In other words, according to this understanding, you're right. There is an extra case over here, but there's a concept of zu vein tzarach l'mer zu. Sometimes we have that. Sometimes for added expression, you'll add a case which is not necessary. So according to this, but all of them are talking about a case where it's placed on the floor. Now, b'masha kasava is the chiddush. B'masha kasava is, of course, that's also going to be a problem. But it's zu vein tzarach l'mer zu. You don't really need to have that. Biba Yisema, another Tarot says, Kula Mitziyasa, the whole middle case, Kula Mitziyasa Nami Denakit Lebiyade. Middle case is talking about where he's holding it. The V'hakamashma is teaching us Kivan Denakit Lebiyade, since he's holding it Afagav Delo Amar Ella Ba, even though he only said Ba. Command Amar Mashakasav Badami. It's as if he said Mashakasav Bad. In other words, the bottom line is coming out to be the same. If a person is referring to the physical Sefer Torah, then it doesn't work. If he's referring to the Azkaros of Hashem inside the Sefer Torah, then certainly it will work. And the question just is, what does he mean when it's placed on the ground, when he's holding it? And those are the various different Turutzim. We still have a couple minutes. Let's start the next Mishnah. The next Gemara's, tomorrow's daf is a very, very interesting daf. We'll get started on the Mishnah just to get our feet a little bit wet, and we'll continue tomorrow. The Mishnah says, Konem Sha'ani Yashan. Person takes a neder Sha'ani Yashan, about sleeping. In other words, that which I will sleep will be a konem. Now, interestingly, we have a similar Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos where it says She'eni Yashan. And if you look at the Ran over here, it fits with what we've been describing throughout the whole Masechta. Mishum Nedarim Mat. The first Rashi, V'kula Garsinon Sha'ani below Yud. We read it without a Yud. In other words, it's Sha'ani, not She'eni. Ubeshvuos Garsinon, Masechet Shavuos, She'eni with a Yud. Why? Mishum Nedarim Matfis Cheftza Anafshe. When it comes to Nedarim, he's associating the object with himself. Tani Lu B'lashon Sha'ani. Klomer Ma Sha'ani. Umishum Shvuos Asar Nafshe. He's talking about himself. Tana Luhu V'lashon Eini, which is talking about me. Now, so a person takes a neder that he's not going to sleep. Shani Medaber, that he won't speak. Shani Mahalech, in other words, that which I will go is a konem. In other words, he's taking a neder not to go anywhere. Homer L'isha Konem Shani Mishamshech. Person takes a neder not to have tashmish with his wife. Harezeh B'lo Yachel Devaro. This person is within the Isra of Lo Yachel Devar who doesn't fulfill his words. In other words, the neder doesn't work. Tomorrow we'll explain exactly why it says Lo Yachel Devar. Why doesn't it just say it's Asr? Have a wonderful day.